sorry. So they told you that was okay. There's some seats scattered out through the back or like anywhere.
We're proud to have you.
Attended a few from the audience.
Yeah, we're proud to have you. Thank you. It means a lot to have you. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is David Pryor, and I'm the director of the Institute of Politics. I see some of you laughing. You like my voice, I know. My accent, I should say. I know y'all get a kick out of this Arkansas accent from time to time. But let me welcome you all here this evening. We have a wonderful panel. We're going to begin this in just a moment. I would first like to just announce that there are 3 students in the audience who have really been real movers and shakers in making this event come about tonight. I hope I get all their names right. Jamie Watson. Jamie, would you stand, please? Where's Jamie? Right here. Jennifer, where are you, Jennifer Adger? Where are you? There's Jennifer right here. Thank you. Jennifer is from Alabama, I believe. Rory Donald. Where is Rory Donald? Anyway, Rory has been very helpful right over here. Thank you, Rory. Rory is one of our fine ushers, and we very, very much appreciate all of you involving yourselves, making a recommendation that we host this forum here tonight. We also thank the sponsoring organizations for making this possible. I'd like to add a personal note. 40 years ago, it's hard for me to believe this, that it's been that long ago, I was a freshman member of the Arkansas State Legislature. The first vote that I had to cast as a freshman member of the state legislature at age 26 or 27 years old was on the death penalty. I had heard a speech on the floor of the House of Representatives that day by a representative who was also a Baptist minister, talking about taking one of his parishioners to the state prison and watching him be executed. I voted against the death penalty that day, 40 years ago, and over time, and as I've gotten older, I think that I have changed my position. It's been an excruciating path to try to decide really how I really felt about this very, very hard question that faces our society on a daily basis. It is my belief that 1,000 years from now, this issue of the death penalty will still be debated. It is an issue of religious, racial, and social implications. And I can tell you without reservation that there are elected officials across our country who are struggling today with this issue and struggling to make the right decision on whether we should continue the death penalty or whether we should not. As a governor of our state, I was very fortunate for a 4-year period that I never had to go through a night of an execution. During that period of time, there were no executions in our state, and I was very, very glad of that fact. Let me say that this is a strong issue. It's an emotional issue, and I'm asking you, in behalf of all of us who are sponsoring this forum tonight, for all of us be respectful of the other's opinions, for us to be civil, because that is what makes this country so great, so strong, is to respect the other positions and the other points of view, regardless of how we might feel. Let me, without further ado, if I could, present to you Professor Carol Steiker of the Harvard Law School, who will be our panel moderator this evening. Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator, and thanks to the Kennedy School Forum for hosting us tonight on such an important topic. Well over a half a century ago, in 1931, the year before his appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court, Benjamin Cardozo predicted that, quote, "Perhaps the whole business of the retention of the death penalty will seem to the next generation, as it seems to many even now, an anachronism too discordant to be suffered, mocking with grim reproach all our clamorous professions of the sanctity of life." Well, the operative word here has turned out to be perhaps, because while capital punishment did go into a long, slow decline in this country between the 1930s and the 1960s, and was even temporarily abolished by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1972, it was reinstated by the court in 1976, and it's been on a steeply upward trajectory ever since, even as the rest of the Western industrialized world has completely abandoned its use. Indeed, in the last 2 years, 2 calendar years, 1999 and 2000, more people were executed each year in the United States than in any prior year since 1951. Despite these growing numbers, Cardozo's words cannot be rejected out of hand as merely a wishful projection from a bygone era. For the first time in several decades, the American people have begun seriously reconsidering our practice of capital punishment in what appeared, at least until recently, to be a sea change in public attitudes about the death penalty. Examples of this sea change in polling data: a national poll earlier this year found support for the death penalty at a 2-decade low of 60%. And when offered life imprisonment without possibility of parole and restitution to the victim's family, support for the death penalty fell to 38%, with 48% supporting the alternative. The same poll showed that 72% of respondents favored suspension of the death penalty until questions about its fairness can be studied. Not just in public attitudes and polling data, but in executive action, we see signs of a sea change. Republican Governor George Ryan took the unprecedented action of declaring a moratorium on all executions in Illinois. Moreover, in one of his last acts in office, former President Clinton stayed what was to be the first federal execution for several decades and ordered the Justice Department to complete a study on racial and geographic disparities in the use of the federal death penalty. Not just executives, but legislatures. New Hampshire became the first state in more than 2 decades to vote to repeal its capital punishment law, vetoed ironically by its Democratic governor, Jeanne Shaheen. And even here in Massachusetts this year, the death penalty last year, our consistent Republican administrations have introduced bills to reinstate the death penalty in Massachusetts, Massachusetts being one of 12 states that doesn't currently have the death penalty. So the Republican governors have introduced bills to reinstate it. The last one was in the last legislative session 3.5 years ago. And as many of you may remember, in a very dramatic vote, it actually passed the House by 1 vote. And the House was really the key player here. We would have had the death penalty had not a single state legislator changed his mind in the wake of the Louise Woodward trial. Remember the nanny trial, saying juries get these things wrong, can't support the death penalty. And by 1 vote, the death penalty was not reinstated in Massachusetts 3.5 years ago. Just this year, same bill to reintroduce the death penalty was defeated 92-60 here in Massachusetts. So you see the same movement across the country, different parts of the country, a sea change in attitudes. And yet, the execution of Timothy McVeigh and then the tragic events of September 11th may now be turning the tide of public attitudes yet again, as Americans for the first time seem to be wondering whether there might be some room in our criminal justice system for, say, indefinite detention without trial, or even the use of torture and interrogation. In times like these, it's hard to convince many people that there's never a need for, or a use for, or a justification for the ultimate punishment. So tonight, we have a distinguished panel here of quite disparate views on this topic, who can give us some helpful perspectives, I think, on this perennially perplexing problem. So let me introduce our first speaker for tonight, seated right next to me. Hugo Badeau is an emeritus professor of philosophy at nearby Tufts University, where he currently teaches a class on the death penalty. He's the author of many books, including Death is Different and the Death Penalty in America. A renowned critic of the death penalty, Professor Badeau recently served as chair of the National Coalition Against the Death Penalty. Professor Badeau.
Thank you, Carol. I wanted us to take a look at the death penalty today by reference to its recent past. And I'm going to do this by means of 7 numbers, which I want you to think about as I speak. The first and the biggest number is 20,000. That's roughly the number annually in the 1990s of persons victims of criminal homicide. 20,000. 14,000 people were arrested concerning those 20,000 crimes. And of those 14,000, some 12,000 were prosecuted, 9,000 of them convicted, and now the attrition really sets in. 2,000 to 4,000 of those who were convicted are what the law calls death eligible because of the nature of the homicide and of the nature of their criminal past, makes them eligible for the death penalty, whereas others who commit criminal homicide and are found guilty of it are not eligible under the law. The attrition then drops again by something like 90% to the number 280. That's the number, the average number in the 1990s of persons sentenced to death. And the final number, the 7th number of them all, is the number 54, the average number of persons executed per year in the 1990s. Now, if you're going to defend the death penalty, as I take it those on the other side of the aisle are going to, they're going to have to defend this system, because this is the system that we've got. This is the system that prevails in our attention in a way that thinking about the death penalty in abstract matter as to whether the American public consisted of Kantian autonomous rational agents, we can ignore all of that because it's essentially irrelevant and divisive and digressive. Now, if you're in favor of the death penalty and you look at these numbers, you have perhaps 3 different ways of responding. If you're a real enthusiast for the death penalty, you really believe murderers deserve to die, and the more who are put to death, the better, you can look at these numbers and only be appalled. It's a disgrace from your point of view that we should live in a system that has 20,000 criminal homicides and only 54 executions. This is unbelievable. What you favor, if you're a hard-bitten enthusiast for the death penalty, is far more executions, far more death sentences, far more death-eligible convicts, far more convictions, far more prosecutions, and far more arrests. The only number you want to go down is the number at the top, that 20,000. If this is your point of view, I'm afraid, to disillusion you. There isn't a chance in the world of your preferred outcome taking place in any foreseeable future. There is no way in which the death penalty, as you fancy it under the terms that I've defined, are going to get your way. So you're mired in irrelevancies in the past if that's your support for the death penalty. Let's look for a moment at the second alternative. This is the alternative of people who say, look, the death penalty was never designed for everyone convicted of criminal homicide. That was never the intention. Once the distinction historically was made between murder and manslaughter, and then 200 years ago the distinction between second-degree murder and first-degree murder in this country, the purpose of these distinctions was to reflect sober judgment that not all murders are the same, not all murderers are the same, and some are more guilty than others. And thus, what we have as you look at these figures is a form of winnowing the worst out of the bad. And in fact, the system is doing the job that we want it to do, that you want it to do. You depart from the group that I've defined first because you don't share their enthusiasm for killing convicted murderers right and left. But you do support the current system. Now, I have disappointing news for you, and I'm going to leave the development of this point largely to my colleague to the left, but I do want to simply say the reason why you can't afford to be complacent is that the system doesn't winnow out the worst from the bad. It winnows out people according to all sorts of irrelevant considerations, highly relevant in the racist and sexist society in which we live, but utterly irrelevant to the way in which the statutes are drawn and the courts are supposed to interpret them. That brings us to the third possibility. which I suspect is true of many on this, here tonight and many outside this room as they contemplate the situation in the United States today. You recognize that the system is not working as it ought to. You recognize that miscarriages of justice are legion. Many of them corrected, those are the ones we know about. You'll be happy to know that finally at last one government has exonerated as innocent persons put to death for crimes they were not guilty of. I'm referring to the recent act to establish the innocence of the Salem witches. That's about as frequent as we ever get any government admitting that it has done wrong by way of executing somebody who's innocent. No state or federal government in this country has ever made such a concession. Well, if this is your point of view, I applaud your facing the facts, but I want to draw to your attention that it may be beyond your power or the power of any of us to provide a system that corrects the woes that you admit exist. The opportunity of bringing about reforms of the sort that are needed is daunting. There's a recent book by Barry Scheck and his colleagues called Actual Innocence, and if you look at the appendix of that remarkable book, you will find nearly 36 specific recommendations that these authors make as necessary conditions to bring about protection of the innocent who are caught up in the criminal justice system but who are not guilty. Those nearly 36 recommendations are not easily going to pass muster from the bar, from the courts, from the legal profession, maybe some of them, but not all of them. So that if Scheck and his colleagues are right, that it is that set of initiatives that needs to be introduced into our law to get the system that you favor, it may be sometime, if ever, that you get it. And indeed, you probably should support, if you aren't already supporting, you should support the Moratorium Movement in the United States, pioneered by the American Bar Association some years ago and put into law and into effect by Governor Ryan in Illinois, as Professor Steicher's already mentioned. You should find the Moratorium Movement as an opportunity to assess the facts about the administration of the criminal justice system in the United States so that we can get more nearly universal agreement on its flaws and some kind of agreement on behalf of the way to improve it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Badeau. Our next speaker, on my right, is Professor David Shaffer, a professor of political science at Holy Cross College in Worcester, where he teaches courses on political philosophy and American political thought. He's also the author of 2 books, The Political Philosophy of Montaigne and Justice or Tyranny, a critique of John Rawls's A Theory of Justice. Professor Shaffer has also held research fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Earhart Foundation, and the Institute for Educational Affairs.
Thank you. I'm going to be addressing the death penalty issue on the level of principle. So from my point of view, it is irrelevant if Professor Badeau, for instance, judges that any increase in the rate of capital punishment is not going to occur, because I thought that what we're doing precisely is having a discussion about to what extent it is justifiable, not what its prospects are. And similarly, I would leave aside what I think are, from this point of view, extraneous generalizations, such as the allegation that we live in a racist and sexist society. Briefly, to say something probably familiar to nearly everybody in the room, there were 3 rationales for the practice of capital punishment: incapacitation, deterrence, and punishment as such, or what is sometimes called retribution. Of these rationales, the first, I think, is unarguable. The only certain way of preventing someone who commits first-degree murder from repeating his crime is execution. Even a true sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole wouldn't guarantee that an imprisoned murderer wouldn't murder a prison guard or fellow inmate, especially if he knew that under no circumstances could he even then face execution as a consequence. And there are many documented cases of released murderers who committed further violent crimes, including murder, after being paroled or after completing their full sentence. In 1991, 13,200 murders were committed by prisoners on probation or parole, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Regarding the second rationale, that of deterrence, until around 1975, there was a considerable disconnect between the claims of most social scientists who had studied the issue and what I will call the common sense of ordinary citizens. That is, until that time, the scholarly studies that had been done on the deterrence issue claimed consistently to show that there was no evidence that the death penalty deterred murder or other crimes to which it might be attached. I think in violation of the teaching of common sense that murderers and potential murderers are not so different from most of us, that in the case of premeditated murderers or somebody contemplating premeditated murder, a consideration of the likely severity of the possible consequences would be irrelevant to the murderer, certainly relevant to most of us. Beginning around 1975 with the work of the econometrician Isaac Ehrlich, and in several other studies by economists since, it has in fact been shown that executions have the effect of preventing, through some combination of deterrence and incapacitation, what Ehrlich estimated as some 8 murders, and what a more recent study by 3 economists from Emory University said might be as many as 18 murderers. That, in other words, according to the correlations that they discovered, just the execution of one murderer was estimated to have the effect of saving 8 or more victims of that murderer had he not been executed. For reasons of time, I'll skip ahead to the third and most fundamental aspect of the capital punishment debate, the question of whether it's legitimate for a community to punish criminals, not merely so as to prevent them from doing further harm, and not merely to deter others from criminal acts, but as a way of giving criminals what they in some sense deserve, and therefore of giving force to the community's belief in the objective rightness of its moral code, as well as offering some kind of vindication and even solace to relatives of the victims of murder. The question is not merely one of a legitimacy of capital punishment, but of punishment as such, because the most forthright opponents of capital punishment have admitted their belief that any imposition of a criminal penalty for the sake of justice or retribution is unacceptable and morally indefensible. Thus, they oppose, even in the case of first-degree murder, not only the death sentence, but also the imposition of true life sentences without parole. Professor Badeau here, responding to a model statute that would limit the punishment of first-degree murderers to a maximum of 20 years without possibility of parole, said that was too long, and the maximum minimum shouldn't be more than 10 years, while the American Law Institute once recommended a limit of only 1 to 10 years for first-degree murder before you're eligible for parole. And the European Union, part of that legion of Europeans condemning President Bush last summer for not holding executions, made a similar argument about the inhumaneness of long prison sentences. To conclude, I will cite the observation of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche in the 19th century, that a society that no longer believes in its right to exact the most severe punishments from criminals is really indicating a kind of relativism, indicating that, after all, it doubts whether the murderer isn't right after all and we wrong. In the words of a 19th century British Royal Commission investigating the death penalty, quote, "The fact that men are hanged for murder is one great reason why murder is considered so dreadful a crime."
Thank you. Our next speaker, Stephen Bright. Stephen Bright is the director of the Atlanta-based Southern Center for Human Rights, a public interest legal project that, among other things, provides legal representation to persons facing the death penalty. He has served in this capacity since 1982. Mr. Bright has represented some of these cases himself, including the 1988 Supreme Court case of Amadeo versus Zant, a case in which a death sentence was set aside because of racial discrimination. He's currently a visiting lecturer at Harvard Law School. Steve.
Thank you, Carol, and good evening, everyone. About a month ago, our office was involved in a case decided by the Georgia Supreme Court in which the court held that Georgia's electric chair was cruel and unusual punishment because of the violent way in which the death penalty was carried out. Georgia started using that electric chair in 1924. And between 1924 and 1 month ago, 349 African Americans and 88 white people were put to death in that electric chair. That gives you a little snapshot of the death penalty in Georgia. Georgia, after all, has been known as the nation's executioner because it has carried out more executions in this century than any other state. Within 4 days of the electric chair being put out of business by the state Supreme Court, the state set its first lethal injection. Last night, Georgia carried out its second lethal injection in the last month. And the person put to death last night was a young man named Jose High. Jose High was 17 years old at the time of the crime that took place here. There were a number of other people involved in the crime who also got sentenced to death, but they were fortunate to have better lawyers than Jose High, and none of them ultimately ended up being sentenced to death. In the last 8 years, Jose High has talked to his mother every day. She's been dead for 8 years. When you say the death penalty represents people who are like the rest of us, Jose High is really much more typical of the people for whom the death penalty is reserved in our country, an African-American youth charged with a crime against a white person, severely mentally ill, in his case a youth at the time at which the crime was committed. The likelihood that Jose High even contemplated that he was going to be caught, let alone punished, at the time this took place is very unlikely. And it continues this pattern that we've seen with the death penalty, imposed upon poor people with court-appointed lawyers, imposed upon African Americans charged with crimes against white people. This brings to 25 now the number of executions that Georgia has carried out in the modern history of the death penalty under its new improved death penalty. It's supposed to be so much better than the one that was declared unconstitutional in 1970. And of those 25 cases, 23 have been cases in which the victims of the crime were white. This is in a state where 65% of the victims of murder are African Americans. The other thing, of course, as Professor Badeau alluded to that we've seen, is the realization that so many of these people that we're sentencing to death are actually innocent of the crimes. Illinois' Governor Ryan declared a moratorium on capital punishment because 13 people had been exonerated, 12 had been executed in that state. Some people have said, well, this shows the system works because all these people have been released. And I don't think the criminal justice system is working when people spend 16 years on death row for a crime they didn't commit. I don't think the criminal justice system is working when 3 of those 13 people were exonerated by the journalism class, the undergraduate journalism class at Northwestern. If those kids had chosen to take chemistry that semester, those people would have been executed. This is not the legal system, it's not the police department, it's not the defense lawyers, it's not the prosecution. It's the journalism class at Northwestern that decides to take on as a class project determining whether somebody like Anthony Porter, who came within 2 days of being executed, had been all the way through the legal system, whether that person's going to be executed, and they go out and get a confession from the person that actually committed the crime. I'm going to respectfully and civilly disagree with Senator Pryor that we're going to be debating this in 1,000 years, assuming we're still here in 1,000 years. Right now, 4 countries account for 88% of all the executions in the world. China, of course, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. That's 4 countries, almost 90% of all the executions. Since 1985, 40 countries that have had the death penalty have abolished it. During that same period of time, only 4 countries that didn't have the death penalty have adopted it. One of those, Nepal, has since abandoned the death penalty. The only NATO country besides the United States that has the death penalty is Turkey, and Turkey hasn't carried out an execution since 1984, and it's abandoning the death penalty because you can't join the Council of Europe if you have the death penalty. In some ways, I think the tragic things that we've seen in the world recently kind of put the death penalty in a sad perspective. We have war crimes trials going on in The Hague with people guilty of genocide, people responsible for hundreds, even thousands of deaths of other people, killing them because of their race and ethnicity. The death penalty is not even on the table. Here in the United States, we're sentencing people to death because they were involved in a 7-Eleven robbery in which somebody was killed. Not to say that those people shouldn't be punished, not to say that we shouldn't be protected. But the difference there, we're going to find that we're not going to be able to extradite terrorists from Germany or France or other European countries because they will not extradite terrorists to countries that have the death penalty. Will not extradite anyone to countries that have the death penalty. And I would just end by saying that I think sooner, I don't know if it'll be in this century, but I think it'll be sooner than 1,000 years. That will come to a conclusion much like the Constitutional Court of South Africa did. There's a country with a history much like ours of using the death penalty, a lot of racial bias, the use of the criminal justice system to keep people down based upon their race. A tremendous problem of violent crime, but that court said we are building a new society, a society that is moving from hatred to understanding, that's moving from vengeance to reconciliation. And in that society, there's no place for the death penalty. And I think ultimately that's where the world has to go. Thank you.
Follow that. Okay. Jeff Jacoby joins us from the Boston Globe, where he's been an op-ed columnist since 1994. Before joining the Globe, Jeff served as the chief editorial writer for the Boston Herald, a position he held since 1987. Often infusing his conservative ideas into the traditionally liberal paper, he has been labeled the region's preeminent spokesman for conservative nation. That's pretty good. In addition to his work in print, Jeff can regularly be heard on WBUR, Boston's national public radio affiliate. In 1999, he became the first recipient of the Bryndale Prize, a major award for opinion journalism. Jeff.
Thank you very much, Professor Stryker. Professor Bright is indeed a hard act to follow. In fact, when I was invited to come speak here tonight and I was told what the panelists on the other side of this issue, who they were going to be, in fact, it was Professor Bright at first, who was the first name that was confirmed. I got in touch with a friend of mine who's been active in this issue and asked him what he knew about Stephen Bright and his work, and the message that I got back was certainly a daunting one. He said, he is by far the most fearsome debater. He comes prepared with all of his facts, and audiences love him. So I knew coming in tonight what I would be up against. Let me try to share with you in just a few minutes that I have what I see as the case for capital punishment. It boils down, in my view, to 2 essential reasons. One is moral, and one is practical. First and foremost, above all others, is the moral argument, and that is that the death penalty is just. It is a fundamental matter of fairness, it seems to me, that someone who deliberately and cruelly steals another person's life does not deserve to keep his own. Capital punishment fits the crime of murder as no other punishment can. Murder is the worst of all possible crimes. Capital punishment is the worst. It deserves the worst of all punishments, which under our system is capital punishment. If we like, we can denounce murder at the top of our lungs. We can write books and give speeches and write op-ed columns about how terrible it is and how monstrous it is and how evil it is. But at the end of the day, a society that sentences murderers to nothing worse than prison is a society that doesn't consider murder to really be that bad. The second reason for capital punishment is the practical one. And simply stated, when murderers aren't killed, more innocent people die. They die in some cases because killers kill again. of the people on death row in the United States now, 1 in 12 were sentenced to death for this murder after having been previously convicted of an earlier murder. And innocent people die when murderers aren't executed because potential killers get the message that no matter what they do to another human being, they will never have to pay with their life. And you should have no doubt potential killers get that message. Look at what happened in this country when the death penalty was taken off the table. In the United States, executions pretty much ground to a halt in the mid-1960s. They didn't really get started again until the late 1970s, early 1980s. This as a result of the Supreme Court's moratorium on capital punishment until all the states had rewritten their statutes. In that decade and a half, from 1965 to 1980, during those 15 years or thereabouts when the death penalty wasn't even a possibility for any potential murderer out there to face, murder in this country skyrocketed. From 9,900 murders in 1965 to 23,000 in 1980. In the short time that I have before we open up the floor to questions, let me address two of the arguments that you've heard Professor Bright make. First is this question of innocence. Opponents of capital punishment would have you believe that it's meted out capriciously, that it's imposed carelessly. They tell you about all these people who were freed from death row, who were innocent. They'd have you believe, draw the conclusion that innocent people must be getting executed as well. But here's what they don't tell you. They don't tell you that there is not a single proven case in modern times, and by modern times I mean since capital punishment began again after the Supreme Court authorized it. I make no claim for what Georgia was doing in 1924. But in modern times, there is not a single proven case of an American prisoner being executed for a murder he didn't commit. Not one. And I assure you, if there were such a case, and if it had been proven, everybody in this room would know the person's name because it would instantly become a cause célèbre and famous far and wide. Here's what else they don't tell you. Thousands of death row inmates, not just a few dozen, thousands of death row inmates have been released from death row because their conviction was overturned, often on a technicality or for a procedural reason, because their sentence was commuted, because a new trial was ordered, because the governor granted them a pardon. Thousands of people who have gone on to death row in the last 30 years have been released from death row alive. It isn't a sign of failure when an inmate leaves death row alive. It's a sign that the legal system works. There's no aspect of American criminal law that is as relentless and as obsessive as the search for grounds to set aside a death sentence. And that's why appeals from these sentences go on for years, even when there isn't the slightest doubt about the murderer's guilt. Of all the punishments that a criminal in this country can get, none is less arbitrary or less capricious or less likely to be carried out in error than the death penalty. And finally, this question of racial disparity. It seems to me that this is the ugliest of all arguments against capital punishment, not just because it's false, but because it's designed to inflame and to aggravate racial tensions. The facts are clear. Most inmates on death row are white, not black. Most people executed each year are white, not black. Blacks account for almost 50% of all murderers, but they account for only 35% of those executed. If anything, they are underrepresented on death row. I want the death penalty because it is just. I want the death penalty because it is practical, because when murderers are killed, more innocent people keep their lives. That, it seems to me, is the ground on which this discussion should take place, and I look forward to the discussion tonight and to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of our very fine speakers. I'm going to open the floor to the audience now. There are microphones around the room. Let me just ask you, when you ask a question, please, to identify yourself and direct the question to a particular member of the panel. Questions?
Yep. Over.
Can't really see. There's somebody.
One up here. Hello?
Oh, there you go. Okay. Yes.
Yes, sorry, this is for the gentleman from the Boston Globe. I didn't get
And you
your name.
are?
My name is Jonathan. I'm a Kennedy School student.
Great.
Sorry, didn't catch your name, but I was just wondering, the first kind of platform of your argument was that any country that doesn't have a death penalty doesn't consider murder that bad. And I was wondering how you would respond to an alternative interpretation of that, which is that any country that doesn't have a death penalty is so against murder that they're unwilling to risk committing it themselves.
I would respond by saying that while I understand the argument, it doesn't seem compelling to me, because it's an argument that you can extend in the first place to every form of punishment. A country that is so against kidnapping and false imprisonment that it doesn't want to take the risk of committing it itself will abolish all prison sentences. A government that doesn't want to take the risk of stealing unlawfully from people will abolish all fines. You cannot say that because there's always a possibility of human error, and I would argue that at least in this country when it comes to capital punishment, that error is as remote and as speculative as can be imagined. Just because the possibility exists in the criminal justice system, as in any human system, that error might take place, is no argument for saying, therefore, that system shouldn't be permitted. If it was a logical and persuasive and rational argument, then we would have to shut down operating rooms, because we know that there's a danger that innocent people will die on the operating table if a surgeon makes a mistake. We would have to shut down the highways, because we know that there's a chance that innocent people, through no fault of their own, will die on the highways because a driver makes a mistake. But we don't consider surgery to be of such little value that we're going to abolish it for fear that a mistake might take place. We don't say that transportation is of such low value that we will forbid it for fear that deaths of innocent people might be caused. And since in those cases the danger of the death of an innocent person is infinitely greater than when it comes to capital punishment, it seems to me that it would be equally irrational and illogical and ultimately harmful, and it would lead to the deaths of far more innocent people if we were to say, because we fear that there's the possibility that an innocent person might, under some terrible set of circumstances, be executed, we will abolish this form of justice. We will not permit this kind of criminal justice to take place, knowing if we do that, that one of the results will be the deaths of far more innocent victims.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, I think you may get a little carried away there, Jeff, because I think what those countries are saying when they don't have capital punishment, what all our friends in Europe are saying with Scandinavian countries, South Africa, Russia, all the countries that have done away with it, is we are not going to engage in the same kind of behavior as the criminals. We don't rape rapists. We don't mutilate mutilators. At one time, we did put people in the stocks and we cut off their hands, and we had a lot of these sort of primitive forms of punishment, but capital punishment is the only one of those that has survived. Nobody's suggesting that people that commit murder should be allowed to go free, or that people that commit kidnapping should be allowed to go free. It's just a question of how do you punish that, and do you bring the society down to the same level as the people that you're punishing. We have maximum security prisons here where we can punish people without any ability to be engaged with another person at all, and super maximum prisons, and we're unfortunately putting a lot of people in those all the time.
Let me get another question.
Hi, this is a question to either of the advocates for the death penalty.
And you are?
Sorry, my name's Kieran McAvoy. I'm a visiting professor in the law school. I'm from Belfast, Northern Ireland, and my area of work is primarily around the issue of terrorism. So I'm interested in either of the advocates of the death penalty to say what your feelings would be to the question of deterrence, and particularly in the question of terrorism. Surely after September 11th, the whole deterrence debate goes out the window in terms of the death penalty. Either of the advocates, if you'd like to comment on that point.
It hardly seems to me to be relevant to say that because of the exceedingly rare case of certain fanatics, like the kamikaze pilots of Japan in 1945, it follows that capital punishment doesn't deter crimes. Obviously, no mode of punishment deters all crimes, even if we had some horrible medieval torture as our punishment, which is not something I favor. I don't believe, of course, that that would have deterred Osama bin Laden's men, nor do I see, maybe you could explain further, how this bears on the deterrence issue with respect to most murders.
It seems to me to have always been a major plank of the arguments in favour of the death penalty, the deterrence. Both of you alluded to it. In our context in Ireland, even Mrs. Thatcher, who was a very strong proponent of the death penalty, accepted the arguments that in terms of terrorism it simply wouldn't work, and also accepted another argument that it would in effect create martyrs amongst political organizations, that it would be a way of mismanaging political violence. So I'm kind of interested that if you're saying that the deterrent, you would accept that it doesn't work in terms of terrorism and so forth, that's fine, but it just seems to me that's removing a major plank of your argument.
It seems definitional. Jeff can elaborate. It seems definitional to me that a death penalty will not deter a suicide bomber. That's more or less a tautology. But most murders in the United States, the vast majority of murders in the United States, have not been committed by suicide bombers.
If I can just add one thought to it, I understand the point that you make. A suicide bomber isn't going to be deterred by the knowledge of what punishment awaits him if he fails to kill himself. But I don't argue, and I don't know any advocate for capital punishment who does argue, that deterrence is the only reason to have capital punishment. I began by saying that for me, the overriding reason, the first and foremost reason to kill capital murderers is because it's a just response to their crime. It's a moral and decent response to their crime. And frankly, it seems to me outrageous that somebody who steals another person's life is then allowed to keep his own. That has nothing to do with the case of the suicide bomber who's going to kill himself in any case. It certainly does apply to other kinds of terrorists who don't kill themselves. If you're able to lay your hands on them and prosecute and convict them, they are deserving of the death penalty, assuming that the usual criteria are met, because of what they did, not because of whether or not some future terrorist per se is going to be deterred by what you do to this one.
Excuse me, Jeff, I want to, at the risk of insulting you, I want to suggest that your endorsement of the moral ground for the death penalty is hypocritical. Is it just, and does justice require that we rape rapists? Does justice require that we maim those who maim? You haven't got a principle to fall back on. If you do, it goes like this, that the punishment is just if and only if it fits the crime as near as possible, the old doctrine of an eye for an eye. But you don't believe it when it comes to kidnapping, embezzlement, rape, assault, and maiming. Somehow, only the death penalty for murder is the case that is defended by your principle. I don't consider that a principle at all. I consider that begging the question.
This debate isn't taking place as if the subject of criminal justice and retribution and what is fair and what isn't fair has never before been discussed or been decided. We aren't coming here tonight as though there isn't a long legal and moral tradition that stands behind us. We are at the point in this period of development of our civilization where we understand that we don't rape rapists. What might have been done 500 or 1,000 years ago is far less relevant than what we know is true right now today. But 100 years ago, capital punishment was available for all kinds of crimes that had nothing to do with murder. And I would have argued then, I hope, as I would argue now, that it was illegitimate and improper in every case except for murder. What I said before, it seems to me, can't be argued. Murder is the worst of all crimes. It deserves the worst of all punishments. In our legal tradition, in our moral tradition, in the American tradition, the worst of all punishments is execution. And it seems to me that you cannot say that you treat murder as seriously as you can be treating it. You cannot argue that you are giving it the weight and the fearsomeness that it's due if you're going to say that murder will be punished by something less than the worst that your criminal justice system allows.
So would you give the death penalty for all 9,000 people convicted of murder every year? I mean, right now we average, as Hugo said, about 280 people are sentenced to death. The legal system is choking to death trying to process those cases. Would you actually say that everybody who's convicted of murder in this country ought to get the death penalty?
No, of course not, because as we all know, you can be convicted of have capital punishment imposed upon you if you are found guilty of capital murder. It isn't simply homicide that qualifies for the death penalty. There have to be aggravating circumstances. These may differ in some slight degree from state to state, but by and large, we all understand that somebody who gets into a fight with a friend over a card game, pulls a gun and shoots him, isn't going to be eligible for capital punishment in the United States. I was interested, actually, Professor Badeau, to hear that little inverse pyramid of numbers that you began with, because it seems to me that you could generate similar numbers for virtually any pairing of crime and punishment in this country. Vastly more rapes are committed in the United States than the number of rapists who go to prison for it. Vastly more armed robberies take place than the number of armed robbers who go to prison for it. If you're going to say that it somehow makes the punishment illegitimate if you aren't scooping up into it a much larger percentage of those who commit the crime, then we're going to have to invalidate all punishment. And it seems to me that time and again, when you start going down the road that the abolitionists invite you to go down, you end up at a place where you are making an argument that cannot be restricted only to the death penalty. If you're going to argue these things for the death penalty, you can't logically not argue it for other punishment. And that, it seems to me, is a dead end.
Oh, you, right there.
I'm Ashley George. I'm a student from Wellesley College. I want to direct my question to the death penalty defenders. You seem to think that you've addressed the bias within death penalty. What you ignored, or maybe I wasn't listening, was the fact that you are less likely to be given the capital punishment if your victim is black. What message does that send? If no death penalty sends the message that murder is okay, doesn't this send the message that murdering black people is okay?
I'll give you 3 answers to that question. The first answer, which is in some ways the most complicated, is that, as I said a minute ago, to qualify for capital punishment in this country, you have to be found guilty of capital murder, murder with aggravating circumstances. And those aggravating circumstances, when you look at the racial breakdown, perpetrator and victim, overwhelmingly those are cases in which the victim was white. For instance, the murder of a federal official while carrying out his duty, murder in conjunction with kidnapping. As those cases occur, when you look at the empirical numbers, they tend to occur with whites as the victims more frequently. The racial breakdown matches roughly, but the racial breakdown matches when you look at the crime and when you look at the punishment. That's the more complicated and less interesting answer. The second answer is that in this country, the murder of black Americans is overwhelmingly an intra-racial crime. Between 90 and 95% of black victims of homicide are killed by black murderers, which means that if you're serious about wanting to see more people who killed black victims executed, what you are calling for is sending more black men, and it's almost always men, more black men to the chair or to get the lethal injection. It's possible that there are death penalty critics out there who would be happy with that result, but I find that I'm being invited into a catch-22 by people who are willing to say, on the one hand, it shows that the system is racially skewed because victims of people who get capital punishment tended to be white, whereas if you would turn it around or equalize the numbers so that the victims were equally black and white, what you would be doing is executing far more black killers. I can't believe that the people who are calling this racial injustice would regard it as racial justice for more blacks to be executed. That's the second answer. And my third answer, which is the simplest, is, are the people who are being executed guilty or innocent? If the people who are being executed are guilty, then at least at some level the inquiry stops there. It's no part of justice to say that because some people get away with it, everybody should get away with it. That because some people don't get the punishment they deserve, nobody should get the punishment they deserve. If you've got the facts and figures and the statistics to lay out and you can make the case that there's some kind of racial imbalance, I am with you in doing anything we can to make that racial balance more accurate. Let's take it to 17 decimal points. But don't tell me that the way we should deal with it is by letting even more people get away with murder. That, I suggest, can't possibly be the proper answer.
Well, I just want to say this because you're wrong on your facts there. I don't know if you've been down south where we try these cases and where we send hundreds and hundreds of people to death row. I don't know if you've ever seen, have you, a capital trial in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, or Texas?
No.
Because, you know, you would know that there's not a relentless search for error in those cases. I mean, some capital cases take a day and a half to try. 2 lawyers in Texas, you know, have 24 people on death row. That's just 2 lawyers between them. That's 3 times Maryland's death row. But with regard to the statistics on the race, we've run these over and over in one judicial circuit after another. Any felony murder can be a death penalty case. The death penalty is defined so broadly now that virtually any homicide is death eligible. Any murder in the commission of a robbery, in the commission of any other crime, and then just in case it's not covered, every state has a catch-all aggravating circumstance that any death that's heinous, atrocious, and cruel. Well, every murder by definition is heinous, atrocious, and cruel. So what have we done? We've given the prosecutors complete discretion to decide which cases are going to be death penalty cases and which aren't. And the two most important decisions in every capital case are not made by a jury or by a judge. They're made by a prosecutor. Do we seek the death penalty in the first instance? If you're in Houston, Texas, it's going to be a death penalty case. Houston has sentenced more people to death and in fact has carried out more executions than any state except Texas itself and Virginia. If you're in Dallas, it's not going to be a death penalty case. If you're in Philadelphia, it's going to be a death penalty case because they seek the death penalty in every homicide. If you're in Pittsburgh, it's not going to be a death penalty case. So that's the first big question. The second question is going to be, is the case plea bargained? Because 90% of these cases are resolved with a guilty plea, where the prosecution withdraws the death penalty in exchange for the person pleading guilty for pleading guilty. The criminal justice system, as offensive as it may be to hear this, we'll never solve this problem unless we hear it. The criminal justice system in America is the part of society that's been least affected by the civil rights movement. 99% of prosecutors in this country are white. In the part of the country I practice in, the decision whether or not a case is going to be a death case or not is made by one white man. And what we found when we looked at this, because in Columbus, Georgia, which sentences more people to death than any other place in Georgia, and we found overwhelmingly the victims of murder, 70%, including armed robberies, including kidnappings, including rapes, were black, and yet 85% of all the people being sentenced to death there were cases involving white victims. We found out that when a white victim was killed, or a white person was killed, the prosecutor would call the family, and he would ask him. We had witnesses testify. The prosecutor called me on the phone. He asked me, "Do you want the death penalty?" I said, "Yes, I want the death penalty," and the prosecutor got it at the trial. We went to people, and there were far more of them in the African-American community. Nobody ever called them. Nobody even called them to tell them that the case had plea bargained out. Nobody even told them what was going on in the case, let alone asked them whether they wanted the death penalty or not. In fact, in that particular case, my client's father, my client was African-American, and his father had been shot and killed in a bar in Columbus, Georgia, and the prosecutor didn't even know about the case, didn't even know who John Brooks was. But he knew when a white person was killed in that community, when somebody in his community, somebody that went to his church, somebody who went to his country club, somebody whose child was the son or daughter of somebody in his country club, and that's why those cases were death cases, because of the race and very much also because of the status of who the victim of the crime was, not because of the aggravated nature of the crime.
Professor Bright, if it's true that 99% of the prosecutors in this country are white, and I'm
talking about the top prosecutor, the person in charge, yeah.
And if it's true that most judges, probably an overwhelming majority, are white, and if it's true that members of juries predominantly are white, then how is it that more whites keep getting sentenced to death than blacks? How is it that more whites get executed every year than blacks when the number of murders committed, broken down by race, is roughly 50-50?
And death row is roughly 50-50. What really controls is the race of the victim. I mean, let me think about this question.
No.
You're going to be thinking about this question.
You're suggesting that there's this terrible plague of racism that infects American criminal justice.
I know. I've seen it with my own eyes.
Fine. I don't dispute that you say what you've seen. But if that's the case, explain to me what kind of racism it is that will enable the prosecutor and the judge and the jury to bypass the defendant who's sitting in front of him, bypass the black defendant, and instead look not at the person who's in the courtroom, but at the victim, and decide based on the color of the victim whether death is the appropriate penalty or not. It seems to me that if racism is as pervasive in the American criminal justice system as you suggest, then far more black people should be getting sentenced to death. And yet that isn't the case.
No.
They are underrepresented on death row as compared with the percentage of blacks who are involved in murder.
Let me give you an example that'll show why. It's not that. It's not that we need to sentence more people to death. Tragically, in this country, we have a lot of convenience store robberies that end in a homicide. Most of those are not, all those are death eligible because it's a robbery murder. Somebody goes in to rob them of cigarettes or money or drugs or whatever it may be, and a murder takes place, either because a security guard comes or there's a fight or the person just shoots the person for witness elimination. For whatever reason, there are a lot of, those are the most prevalent kind of murders that we see in at least the places I practice. Almost never are those prosecuted capitally. But in one case that I had, it was, and the reason was simple. The person who was at the counter that night, who was the victim, was the son of the Brigadier General at Fort Benning. Now, that case registered with the prosecutor. My client happened to be African American, but it wouldn't have mattered whether he was white or African American. What made that a death case was the fact of the status of the victim, the fact that it was the son. The other case that I mentioned a moment ago, the Brooks case, in that case it was the organist at the Methodist Church, a woman of some prominence in the community. And when the white organist at the Methodist Church was killed, that was a case that that prosecutor saw as a death case. When the black organist at the Baptist Church is killed, that case is never even going to get to a jury because the prosecutor's not going to notice that up as a death case and the death penalty is not going to be sought.
Then why don't you?
I want to get back to the audience. There are people queuing up over here.
This question is for Professor Shaffer. Professor Shaffer, you make the argument for incapacitation of murderers. I had two issues with that. One is, how many cases do you know of where someone was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole that they went on to commit another murder? And secondly, given you gave some statistics on convicted murderers who later got out and committed more murders, how many of those, in how many cases was the first murder death penalty eligible? Because it seems to me if it wasn't, the death penalty isn't going to address repeat murderers.
But I missed part of that last point. Could you just repeat that part of that last point?
The point, just that if the initial murder is not death penalty eligible,
right,
the person's not going to get the death
right,
penalty. I don't see how the death penalty is going to prevent them from committing the second crime. Obviously not. I guess my question is, how many do you have any statistics? Do you have any idea of what the breakdown is of things that are murders that are repeat murderers who are convicted of a crime of murder, one that's death penalty eligible, and then go on to commit another one after they're released?
No, I don't have that breakdown. The point what I was trying to stress was this. It seems that the very same arguments that would be cited against the death penalty apply equally against life imprisonment without parole. And in fact, some of the same people making the one argument are making the other argument, like the European Union in an official statement last May. Just recently, as a for instance, I ran across the story of one Wilbert Badeau, who shot 3 hostages during a bank robbery in 1961, killing one of them. And he was sentenced originally to death, then had the sentence commuted to life without the possibility of parole. But now, having become a crusading prison journalist, according to the New York Times, he persuaded a federal appeals court to overturn his conviction on the ground that blacks had been improperly excluded from the grand jury that had indicted him, which had only one black member on it. Nobody denies his guilt in the robbery and murder, but his lawyers are said to hope that in a new trial, he will wind up having to serve only time served. Now, 40 years, I would readily grant, is a long time to have been in jail. But it seems to me, and this shades over from the incapacitation, which is not what I stressed, to the other issues, to think that the worst thing facing you, if you are found guilty of first-degree murder, is, quote unquote, life without the possibility of parole. Bracket, we don't really mean this because sooner or later you may reasonably hope some judge will find some ground for overturning the verdict. And also, we will give you opportunities to pursue vocations like crusading prison journalist while in prison. I think that that prospect sounds much less of a deterrent than either something that will never exist, a guaranteed life sentence without possibility of parole or pardon, or a judicial reversal on some ground unrelated to innocence. And I think also that most people, thinking that if they themselves had a family member victimized by a murderer, would doubt that there was, in any sense, equity between the fate of their murdered relative and the fate of his person sentenced to jail, always with the hope, regardless of the length of a sentence, A, you can become a crusading prison journalist, and B, sooner or later, somebody will get you out. Let me put it this way. When there was considerable applause a few minutes ago for a remark of Professor Badeau's, I wonder if perchance, and I hope this doesn't happen, the United States, instead of killing Osama bin Laden, captures him and then brings him to trial. How many people actually would be thinking then, gee, I sure hope they don't sentence him to death. That would be barbaric. I sure hope they put him in jail. Oh, really? Okay. Okay. I can't argue with that feeling.
Well, you'll certainly be playing right into his hands if you do, because it will make him quite a martyr.
Carol, let me respond to the remark that David made and that earlier that Jeff had made on the theme of deterrence. Jeff invokes the rising crime rate of the 1960s and 70s during the Supreme Court's moratorium on the death penalty as though he'd never heard of the distinction between correlation and causation. When social scientists attempted to meet the objection that you mustn't confuse these two, and the inference that Jeff made does, they've come up empty-handed. There are 3 major published studies in the period in question on the deterrent effect of the death penalty carried out by econometricians. The first by Isaac Ehrlich in 1976, the next by John Juncker, and the more recent in 1980 by Stephen Layson. All of these studies have been thoroughly discredited with regard to establishing any evidence of a deterrent effect of the death penalty. David has mentioned the latest study coming out of Emory. It isn't published yet, as far as I know, and therefore one criticizes it at one's peril. Nonetheless, I would point out 2 things. First of all, the methods that are being used there are exactly the same kind, and the data are hardly any better than those already discredited in the work of Layson, Ehrlich, and Juncker. Secondly, and more important, that study in the version I have in my desk at home doesn't even mention the most significant criticisms that have been made of this kind of research. So that, so far at least, in the version that I've seen of this unpublished study, it's once again providing fuel for conversations of the sort that we're having, but it will turn out simply to be a shadow of itself when it's properly scrutinized.
If you don't want to talk about the 60s and 70s, talk about the 1990s. Across the country, murder rates and number of murders fell in the 1990s. But when you look at the breakdown of states where they fell the fastest and they fell the furthest in states that have capital punishment. And the fastest and furthest yet in the states that actually impose the death penalty on people who are convicted of capital murder. To argue that there's no deterrent effect is simply flying in the face of the facts, the evidence that are on the table in front of you. Harris County, Texas, has seen its murder rate fall by 73% in the last 15 years. Harris County is, the county seat of Harris County is Houston, Texas. It's the location in the United States where capital punishment is exercised the most vigorously of all. Anybody who's contemplating committing murder in Harris County, Texas, has to take into account the fact that the odds are much better that he's going to be executed. It can't simply be a coincidence that virtually all of the decrease in murder rates in this country in the last 10 or 15 years occurred in the states that have capital punishment.
That's not true about Massachusetts.
Hold on.
It's not true about our state.
It's not true about New York.
Hold on. Let me just say the point about causation and correlation is well taken. There's a wonderful thing making its rounds on the internet. It's been a proven fact that all murderers, it's been shown that 99.9% of all murderers consumed bread within the 24 hours before they murdered. So just take that home with you. 99.9% of all murderers ate a slice of bread or some form of bread before their murder. So that's just a cautionary tale about causation and correlation, and we can debate that further. We have time for one more question. Up here.
Hi, my name is Bernadette Atuahen. I'm a joint degree student here at the Kennedy School and also at Yale Law School. When you talk about the death penalty, it's not a philosophical issue whether it's right or wrong, but the unjust administration of the death penalty. Now, the most indigent members of our societies are the ones who are subjected to the death penalty. And basically because of low quality of representation, there are 2 cases I want to bring to your attention. One was when a defense attorney actually fell asleep during very crucial parts of the trial, parts of testimony. It went on appeal, and they ruled that this was not a form of inadequate representation. When you want to talk about injustice, that's unjust. When you talk about the underfunded public defenders' offices, who usually have a lot of times, less than 1 week to prepare for their cases. Now, in order to interview people and do all the things that it should take months to do, but I'm on death row, and you're going to prepare my case in less than 1 week, that's unjust. So I haven't heard you address the injustices related to poverty. I know poverty and race are inextricably linked, but you seem to have a problem dealing with race. So let's deal with I would like you to address the injustices related to poverty in the administration of the death penalty.
I am perfectly happy to agree with you. I'm happy to agree and to concur with you on any proposed reform that you want to lay in front of me that will take us further down the path of making sure that anyone who's on trial for murder, anybody who's facing the possibility of capital punishment, will have the best quality legal representation. And in fact, a lot of states now require that. The statute in Massachusetts that keeps getting introduced every year or so provides, among many other safeguards, that a capital murder defendant will have two attorneys representing him who will be paid at market rates, not at legal aid rates, and who will, at least one of whom will have extensive experience defending capital murder victims, capital murder defendants. I'm happy to agree to that. Let's do everything we can to make sure that trials are as fair as possible, that defendants, whether they're rich or poor, get the best possible legal representation. But at the end of the day, don't say to me that the only way that we can have justice in this country is to let even more murderers get away with it. In the cases that you're talking about, the fundamental question that I want to know the answer to, but before we finish the conversation, is, was he guilty or was he innocent? Did he do it or didn't he do it? And if he did do it, then we can agree that his lawyer wasn't the best, that one of his two lawyers shouldn't have fallen asleep, and if he was having a problem staying awake, he should have been trying that case. But if the guy was guilty, don't say to me that it was injustice. I'm happy to do anything we can to make it possible for people to get the best quality of representation. But let's make sure that we don't say that the only way we're going to improve criminal justice in America is to let more people get away with murder.
The problem with that is that talk is cheap and justice is expensive. And as much as people will talk about how important the right to counsel is and all that, in the states that are sentencing people to death, there wasn't just one lawyer that slept. In Houston, Texas, there have been 3 different cases in which the lawyer appointed by the judges in Houston to represent the accused slept through trial. Now, in Calvin Burdine's trial, which, by the way, only lasted 18 hours, this very elaborate trial that Calvin Burdine had, it lasted 18 hours. He only had one lawyer, and that lawyer slept through quite a bit of the trial. Joe Cannon. Mr. Cannon had 10 clients sentenced to death. The judges kept appointing him. Carl Johnson, he also represented. He slept through Carl Johnson's case. Johnson's been executed. There's no relief for Carl Johnson. So what I'm saying is it's easy for people to pontificate about how we're all in favor of everybody getting an adequate representation. The truth of the matter is, as Robert Kennedy says, the poor person accused of a crime has no lobby. There's nobody in Texas and Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama that's going to put up the money to see that people are adequately defended in any kind of case, including capital cases.
Then why not make that your crusade? Why not argue, we should abolish capital punishment, go around the country and argue in favor of making the laws stronger for legal representation? Make that the case that you're fighting for, not to say we're going to abolish. Let me ask you a question. If you could wave a magic wand and every capital defendant in this country would have the best caliber of legal representation, would you then be in favor or opposed to keeping capital punishment?
I would still be opposed to it for all the reasons we talked about earlier, but that begs the question. The reality of it is we're not changing the scandalous quality of legal representation that people have. And if we are, it seemed to me your position, and particularly if you're conservative, would be once we fix the system, once we give everybody a good lawyer, once we eliminate racial discrimination, once we've done those things, then we'll have capital punishment, but not until then. And we are a long way from there now.
I want to thank all of you for coming and thank especially all of our speakers for giving us a lot of food for thought tonight.
Thank you very much. Let's give this time a great hand. Thank you very much.
2 more hours.
Have you heard about the Emory study before?
Yeah,
okay.
I haven't looked at it. Wow.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's what the forum is all about. It is to take issues like this and exchange ideas, to exchange our beliefs, and to have a free-flowing debate. And this debate has been so good this evening, we are going to continue it upstairs. Where's room 230? Right right up here. We're going to continue this in a student-led discussion. Now, I don't know if our panelists are going to join us or not. I don't believe so. But you're welcome to join in the students' discussion upstairs. We're going to do that immediately. We ask those of you who want to participate in that to feel free to go to 2:30 right up here behind me. The second announcement, we are about to host at 8 o'clock the Prime Minister of Ireland right here. And so we're going to ask everyone to vacate. We've got to bring in additional chairs, and that's going to be at 8 o'clock this evening. We're going to reopen the doors at 7:45. Thank you all, and come back to the forum. Thank you again. Thank you so very much. This got real good and fast.
Thank you.
But civil.
Good to meet you. Good to meet you in a talk. Good to